The kitchen at the Double B Ranch had 3 rules, and Martha Holloway knew them all by heart. Keep the coffee hot. Keep the biscuits coming. Keep your mouth shut. It was the 3rd rule that had kept her alive for 6 years. She stood at the cast-iron stove in the pre-dawn darkness, her hands moving through practiced motions. Flour, lard, buttermilk, salt. The dough came together under her fingers like it always did, soft and yielding, requiring nothing but patience and pressure in the right measure. Outside, Wyoming wind rattled the kitchen windows, carrying the smell of sage and distant rain. Spring of 1891 had come late and mean, dumping snow in April, then baking it off with sudden heat that left the rangeland confused and the cattle ornery. Martha didn't mind the weather's moods. Weather was honest. It didn't pretend to be one thing while plotting another. She rolled the dough flat, cut circles with the rim of a tin cup, arranged them in the pan. Her movements were economical, efficient, no wasted motion, no unnecessary sound. The ranch hands would be up soon, stumbling in with dirt under their nails and hunger in their bellies. And they'd expect what they always got: hot food, strong coffee, and a woman who knew better than to meet their eyes. The bruise on her left ribs had faded to a yellowish green. The one on her thigh was still purple. She'd learned to catalog them, to track their colors like seasons. Fresh ones were red-black, angry and hot. Old ones turned yellow-brown, soft and forgettable. She had 3 fresh, 2 fading, 1 almost gone. By the end of the week, if she was careful, she might be down to just 2. Coffee ready? Martha didn't flinch. She'd heard Thomas coming. He walked heavy in the mornings, still drunk from the night before, his boots dragging across the floorboards like an accusation. Just finished brewing, she said, her voice flat and small, the voice she'd perfected over 6 years of marriage. The voice that said, "I'm not here, I'm not a person, I'm just a function you barely notice." Thomas grunted, poured himself a cup, drank it standing at the counter. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with hands that could break a horse or a woman with equal ease. Once, Martha had thought those hands were capable of gentleness. Once, she'd been stupid enough to believe a lot of things. "Silas wants breakfast early," Thomas said, his words thick and slurred at the edges. "Got some buyer coming in from Cheyenne. Wants to make a good impression." "I'll have it ready." "You better." He left without another word, the door slamming behind him hard enough to rattle the jars on the shelf. Martha let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. 5 minutes. She'd survived 5 minutes. Only about 900 more to go before the day ended, and she could lock herself in the tiny room off the kitchen that Thomas called their quarters. She pulled the biscuits from the oven, golden and perfect, then started on the bacon. The sizzle and pop filled the silence, a familiar soundtrack. She'd cooked in this kitchen for 3 years, ever since Silas Boone had offered Thomas a job as head wrangler in a small house on the property as part of the deal. Thomas had called it a step up. Martha had called it nothing, because she'd learned by then that her opinions didn't matter. The ranch hands started filtering in just after sunrise. 8 men with appetites that could drain a larder and manners that varied from barely passable to outright crude. Martha served them without speaking, refilling coffee cups and replacing empty platters with full ones, her eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance where no one could catch her gaze and mistake it for an invitation. "Mighty fine biscuits, Ms. Holloway," said Pete Garner, the youngest of the crew, a kid barely 20 with more optimism than sense. Martha nodded but didn't smile. Smiling led to conversations. Conversations led to Thomas asking questions. Questions led to his fists. "Leave her be, Pete," said Frank Delaney, the oldest hand, a grizzled man with a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. "Woman's got work to do." Pete flushed and went back to his plate. Martha felt a flicker of something. Gratitude, maybe? Or just relief that someone had shut down the interaction before it could go anywhere. Frank had been at the Double B longer than anyone. He saw things. He didn't say much, but his silence felt different from the others. Less like indifference, more like deliberate choice. The door opened again and Silas Boone walked in. The room didn't exactly go quiet, but the energy shifted. Silas had that effect. He was a tall man, lean and weathered, with gray threading through his dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. He owned 12,000 acres, ran 300 head of cattle, and employed 15 men, but he still ate breakfast with the hands instead of taking it in the main house. Thomas said it was because Silas was too cheap to hire a separate cook. Martha suspected it was because Silas Boone didn't like eating alone. "Morning, boys," Silas said, his voice carrying the rough edges of a man who'd spent most of his life outdoors. He took his usual seat at the head of the long table, and Martha moved automatically to pour his coffee. She kept her eyes down, her hands steady. This was the dangerous part. Silas was observant in a way that made her nervous. He noticed things: a slight limp, a flinch, a too quick retreat. She'd felt his gaze on her before, assessing, measuring, and she'd worked hard to give him nothing to measure. "Biscuits are good today, Martha," Silas said. It wasn't a question, so she didn't respond. She just set the coffee pot down and turned back to the stove, her heart beating a little faster than it should. "She don't talk much, does she?" said one of the newer hands, a man named Cully, with a mean streak and a habit of testing boundaries. "She talks when she's got something to say," Frank said, his tone mild but edged with warning. "Unlike some folks." Cully snorted but let it drop. Martha kept her back to the room, her shoulders tight. She could feel the weight of too many eyes, too much attention. This was how things went wrong, when people noticed her, when they started wondering, when they asked questions that Thomas would hear about later. The meal wrapped up quickly after that. The hands drifted out in twos and threes, heading to their morning chores. Silas lingered, sipping his coffee, flipping through a ledger he'd brought with him. Thomas came back in, smelling like whiskey and horse sweat, and sat down across from his boss. "Buyer's coming at 10, Thomas said. "I'll have the stock ready." "Good. Make sure the yearlings are separated out. I want him to see the best first." Thomas nodded, then glanced at Martha. "You got lunch ready to go?" "I'll have it ready." "She better," Thomas muttered, more to himself than anyone else, but loud enough that Silas heard. Silas looked up from his ledger, his eyes flicking between Thomas and Martha, and for just a second Martha felt the air in the room change. It was subtle, barely there, but she'd learned to read the tiny shifts in pressure that preceded violence, and this felt like the moment before a storm broke. But Silas just went back to his ledger. "Appreciate the meal, Martha." She nodded, still not meeting his eyes, and started clearing plates. Thomas left with Silas, and Martha was alone again. She scrubbed the dishes in water so hot it burned her hands, welcoming the pain because it was clean and simple and made sense. When the kitchen was spotless, she started prep for lunch: cold beef sandwiches, pickles, apples. The buyer would expect something civilized, and Silas would expect her to deliver. The morning bled into afternoon. The buyer came and went. The hands rotated through for lunch. Martha moved through it all like a ghost, present but not present, seen but not seen. It was just after 2 when Thomas came back, and she knew immediately that something was wrong. His face was flushed, his jaw tight. He'd been drinking again. She could smell it from across the room. He slammed the door hard enough to crack the frame. "You embarrass me today?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. Martha's stomach dropped. "No. You sure about that?" "I didn't speak to anyone. I stayed in the kitchen." Thomas crossed the room in 3 strides, backing her against the counter. "Silas said you looked tired. Said maybe I was working you too hard." "I didn't say anything. Don't matter what you said, matters what he thinks. And what he thinks is that I can't manage my own wife." Martha's hands gripped the counter edge. "I'm sorry. Sorry don't fix it." His hand came up fast, catching her across the face with enough force to snap her head sideways. She tasted blood, felt the hot sting spread across her cheekbone. She didn't cry out. She'd learned that crying out only made it worse. "You make me look weak," Thomas hissed, his face inches from hers. "You make me look like I can't control my own house." "I'm sorry," she said again, because it was the only thing she knew to say, the only thing that sometimes worked. He shoved her, hard, and she stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the stove. The hot iron seared her palm, and she bit down on her lip to keep from screaming. "Get dinner ready," Thomas said, his voice flat now. The rage burned out as quickly as it had flared. "And stay out of sight." He left. The door didn't slam this time. It closed with a soft click that was somehow worse. Martha stood alone in the kitchen, her cheek throbbing, her hand screaming, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She ran her burned palm under the pump water, wrapped it in a clean rag, and went back to work. Because that was the thing about survival. It didn't stop for pain. It didn't pause for fear. It just kept grinding forward, one breath at a time, one meal at a time, one day at a time. And Martha had gotten very, very good at surviving. What? The next 3 days passed in a gray blur. Martha kept her head down, her movements small, her presence invisible. Thomas didn't hit her again, but the threat hung in the air like smoke, acrid and choking. She learned to read his moods by the sound of his footsteps, the angle of his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw. When he was calm, she breathed. When he was tense, she disappeared. Silas Boone noticed. She didn't know how she knew, but she did. She'd catch him watching her sometimes, his expression unreadable, his coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. He didn't ask questions. He didn't say anything. But his silence felt different from everyone else's, less like indifference, more like waiting. It made her nervous. On the 4th day, everything changed. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting through the kitchen windows in long golden bars. Martha was kneading bread dough, her hands working the rhythm she knew by heart, when Thomas came in drunk. Not the usual morning drunk, the kind that made him mean and unpredictable. This was worse. This was midday drunk, the kind that said he'd started early and wasn't planning to stop. "Where's my dinner?" he slurred, leaning against the doorframe. "It's not ready yet. You're early." Wrong answer. Thomas crossed the room, grabbed her by the arm, yanked her away from the counter. The dough fell to the floor with a wet slap. "Don't you tell me I'm early," he snarled. "Don't you ever tell me what I am." "Thomas, please." His fist caught her in the stomach, doubling her over. She gasped, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He hit her again, this time in the ribs, and she went down, her knees cracking against the floorboards. "You think you're something," Thomas said, his voice thick and hateful. "You think you matter, but you don't. You're nothing, you hear me? Nothing." He kicked her, once, twice, and she curled into herself, trying to protect her head, her ribs, anything vital. The pain was white-hot, blinding, and she thought dimly that this was it. This was the time he'd go too far. This was how it would end. And then the door opened. "Thomas!" Silas Boone's voice cut through the room like a blade. Thomas froze, his boots still raised. Martha didn't move, didn't breathe. She could see Silas from the corner of her eye, standing in the doorway, his expression carved from stone. "Get out," Thomas said, his words slurred but venomous. "This is between me and my wife." "Step away from her," Silas said, his voice flat and absolutely final. "You don't tell me what to do in my own house." "This is my property," Silas said, "and that woman cooks for my men. So, yeah, Thomas, I do get to tell you what to do. Now step away." For a long, terrible moment, Martha thought Thomas would refuse. She could feel the violence coiled in him, ready to snap in a different direction. But then he lowered his boot, stepped back, his hands opening and closing into fists. "Fine," Thomas spat. "Take her. See if I care." He shoved past Silas and out the door, his boots heavy and furious on the porch steps. Silas stood there for a moment, his jaw tight, his eyes unreadable. Then he crossed the room and crouched down beside Martha. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. Martha nodded, even though she wasn't sure. She pushed herself up, her ribs screaming, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. Silas didn't touch her, but he stayed close, ready to catch her if she fell. "I'm fine," she managed, the lie automatic. "No, you're not." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw something in his face that terrified her more than Thomas's fists ever had. Pity. "I'm fine," she said again, harder this time. "I just need to finish dinner." "Martha, please," her voice cracked. "Please just let me work." Silas stared at her for a long moment, and she saw the argument building in his eyes, but then he nodded, stood up, and stepped back. "All right," he said quietly, "but this isn't over." He left, and Martha was alone again. She picked up the dough from the floor, threw it away, started over. Her hands shook, her ribs screamed, her breath hitched every few seconds, catching on pain and fear, and something else she didn't have a name for. But she kept working, because that was what she did. That was all she knew how to do. That night, Martha didn't sleep. She lay in the narrow bed in the room off the kitchen, listening to Thomas snore in the chair where he'd passed out, still fully dressed, still reeking of whiskey. Her ribs ached with every breath. Her stomach was a knot of nausea and terror. Silas had seen. That was the thought that kept circling through her mind, relentless and inescapable. Silas had seen, and now everything was different. For 6 years, she'd survived by being invisible, by making sure no one looked too close, asked too many questions, cared too much. But Silas had looked. Silas had asked. And worse, Silas had cared. And she didn't know what happened next. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it brought a cold, creeping dread that settled into her bones and wouldn't leave. Because Martha knew how this story went. She'd seen it before, in other towns, other lives. When men like Silas intervened, things got complicated, lines got drawn, choices got made. And women like her, quiet, powerless, trapped, they got caught in the middle and crushed. She didn't want to be crushed. She wanted to disappear. But it was too late for that now. When dawn finally came, pale and hesitant through the kitchen window, Martha dragged herself out of bed and started the coffee. Her body moved on autopilot, muscle memory taking over where thought failed. She had bruises on top of bruises now, layers of pain so deep and familiar they'd become part of her baseline. The hands came in for breakfast. Frank gave her a long look but didn't say anything. Pete kept his eyes on his plate. Cully smirked, and she knew, somehow he knew, and it amused him. Silas didn't come. Thomas sat at the table, hungover and surly, shoveling eggs into his mouth like he was trying to punish them. He didn't look at Martha, didn't speak to her, just ate, drank his coffee, and left. The day crawled forward. Martha cooked, cleaned, prepped, and tried not to think about the fact that her entire world had shifted on its axis, and she had no idea how to shift it back. It was mid-morning when Frank came back into the kitchen, his hat in his hands, his expression uncomfortable. "Silas wants to see you," he said. "In the main house." Martha's heart stopped. "Why?" "Didn't say. Just said to fetch you." She wiped her hands on her apron, tried to slow her breathing, failed. "When?" "Now." There was no refusing. You didn't refuse Silas Boone, not on his ranch, not anywhere. Martha followed Frank across the yard to the main house, a sprawling structure that she'd only ever seen from the outside. It was well kept but sparse, functional rather than fancy. Silas wasn't a man who cared much for decoration. Frank left her at the door. She stood there for a long moment, her hand raised to knock, her entire body trembling. "Come in," Silas called before she could touch the wood. She pushed the door open, stepped inside. The interior was dim and cool, smelling faintly of leather and tobacco. Silas sat at a large desk near the window, papers spread out in front of him. He looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable. "Close the door," he said. She did, her hand shaking on the knob. "Sit down." There was a chair across from the desk. She sat, perched on the edge like a bird ready to bolt. Silas leaned back, studying her with those sharp, assessing eyes. "How long?" he asked finally. Don't lie to me, Martha. How long has Thomas been hitting you?" The question hung in the air between them, blunt and inescapable. Martha's throat closed. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. "Since the beginning?" Silas pressed. "Or did it start later?" "It's not—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "It's not your concern. It is when it happens on my property. I'm his wife. That doesn't give him the right to beat you half to death." Martha flinched at the words, at the anger behind them. "Please," she whispered, "just let it be." "I can't do that." "Why?" The word came out sharper than she intended, edged with desperation. "Why do you care?" Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said simply, "Because it's wrong." And that was the thing that broke her. Not the violence, not the fear, not the years of silence and survival, but kindness. Simple, straightforward, unbearable kindness. Martha felt something crack deep in her chest, and before she could stop herself, tears were streaming down her face. She covered her mouth with her hand, trying to muffle the sound, trying to hold it together, but it was too late. 6 years of pain and terror and suffocating silence came pouring out, and she couldn't stop it. Silas didn't move, didn't speak. He just sat there, waiting, until the storm passed and she could breathe again. "I'm sorry," she gasped, wiping at her face with shaking hands. "Don't be." I shouldn't have. Martha. His voice was firm but not unkind. You have nothing to apologize for. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw something in his face that she hadn't expected. Resolve. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice small and scared. I'm going to fire him, Silas said. Today. And I'm going to make sure he leaves this ranch and doesn't come back. Panic flooded through her. No, you can't. He'll what? Hit you again? Kill you? Silas leaned forward, his eyes hard. Because that's where this is headed, Martha. You know that. She did know. She'd known for years. But knowing and facing were two different things. If you fire him, I'll have to leave too, she said, trying to make him understand. I have nowhere to go. No money, no family. I'll end up on the street or worse. You can stay here. The words hit her like a physical blow. What? I need a cook. You're good at the job. Stay on. Work for me, not for him. People will talk. Let them talk. They'll say... She stopped, her face burning. They'll say things. About me. About you. I don't care what they say. I do. The words came out fierce, surprising her. I care. Because if they think we're... She couldn't finish the sentence. Silas's expression softened. I'm offering you a job, Martha. That's all. A place to work, a place to sleep, and a wage. Nothing more. Thomas won't allow it. Thomas doesn't get a say anymore. Martha shook her head, her mind spinning. It was too much, too fast, too impossible. I can't. Why not? Because... She struggled to find the words. To explain the fear that had lived in her bones for so long, it felt like part of her skeleton. Because I'm his wife, because leaving him means everything changes, means I'm on my own, and I don't know how to be on my own. You've been on your own for 6 years, Silas said quietly. You just didn't know it. The truth of that statement hit her hard. She'd been alone in her marriage, alone in her pain, alone in her survival. Thomas had never been a partner. He'd been a jailer, but knowing that and acting on it were two very different things. I need time, she whispered. Silas nodded. You've got until tomorrow. But after that, Thomas leaves. With or without you, that's not changing. Martha stood on shaking legs, her mind a blur of terror and possibility. Thank you, she said, though she wasn't sure what she was thanking him for. Don't thank me yet, Silas said. Choosing to live is the hard part. She left the main house and walked back to the kitchen in a daze. The world looked different now, sharper, brighter, more real. Or maybe it was the same, and she was different. That night, Thomas came home late and mean. He didn't hit her, but the threat was there, simmering just beneath the surface. He muttered about Silas, about respect, about being undermined. Martha didn't respond. She just moved through the space, small and careful, and waited for morning. When dawn came, she made her choice. She packed nothing. She owned nothing worth packing. She simply walked out of the room she'd shared with Thomas, crossed the yard to the main house, and knocked on Silas Boone's door. When he opened it, she said 3 words that would change everything. I'm staying here. Silas looked at her for a long moment, standing there in his doorway with the morning sun at her back, her hands twisted together, her face pale but set. He didn't smile, didn't offer platitudes or reassurances. He just nodded once, stepped aside, and said, Come in. Martha crossed the threshold, and the door closed behind her with a quiet finality that made her stomach lurch. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. The enormity of the choice settled over her like a weight, and for a second she thought her legs might give out. Sit, Silas said, gesturing to the same chair she'd occupied the day before. I'll make coffee. She sat, her back rigid, her hands folded in her lap. The main house felt different in the early morning light, less imposing, more lived in. There were books stacked on a side table, a pair of worn boots by the door, a jacket hanging from a peg. Evidence of a solitary life, but not a lonely one. Silas moved around the small kitchen area with the ease of a man used to doing for himself. He poured 2 cups of coffee, handed her one, and took the seat across from her. Thomas know yet? He asked. No, he was still asleep when I left. He's going to be angry. I know. Silas studied her over the rim of his cup. You sure about this? Martha's hands shook slightly, making the coffee ripple. No, but I'm doing it anyway. Something flickered in Silas's eyes. Respect, maybe, or approval. All right then. Here's how this is going to work. You keep cooking for the hands, same as before. Room and board plus wages. $15 a month. $15. More money than Thomas had ever let her touch. That's generous, she said quietly. It's fair. You work hard. He paused. You'll stay in the small room off the kitchen for now. When Thomas is gone, we'll figure out something better. When he's gone, Martha repeated, the word strange in her mouth. You really think he'll just leave? I think you won't have a choice. And if he doesn't go quietly? Silas's expression hardened. Then I'll make sure he does. Before Martha could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps on the porch outside made them both freeze. The door burst open and Thomas filled the frame, his face red, his eyes wild. There you are, he snarled, his gaze locked on Martha. What the hell do you think you're doing? Martha's heart hammered against her ribs. She started to stand, old instincts screaming at her to placate, to apologize, to make herself small. Sit down, Silas said, his voice cutting through her panic. It wasn't loud, but it carried absolute authority. Martha sat. Thomas's attention snapped to Silas. This is between me and my wife. No, Silas said, standing slowly. It's not. Martha works for me now. She's my employee, and you're trespassing in my house. Employee? Thomas laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Is that what you're calling it? Everyone on this ranch is going to know exactly what kind of arrangement you two have. Then they'll know I hired a cook, Silas said evenly. Same as I hired you as a wrangler. Same as I hired Frank and Pete and everyone else. Only difference is, you're fired. The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Thomas went very still. What did you say? You're fired. I want you off my property by sundown. You can't do that. I just did. Thomas took a step forward, his hands curling into fists. You think you can take my wife and fire me? You think I'm just going to walk away? I think you don't have a choice. She's mine, Thomas said, his voice dropping to something dangerous and possessive. She's my wife. She goes where I go. Not anymore, Martha said. The words came out before she could stop them, small but clear, and the room went dead silent. Thomas turned to stare at her, his expression shifting from anger to something colder, more calculating. What did you say? Martha's throat was dry, her heart a drum in her chest, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. I'm not going with you. Like hell you're not. I'm staying here. I'm working for Mr. Boone, and you... Her voice wavered but didn't break. You don't get to hit me anymore. Thomas moved fast, crossing the room in 2 strides, his hand raised. But Silas was faster. He stepped between them, his hand clamping down on Thomas's wrist with enough force to make the bigger man grunt. Touch her, Silas said, his voice low and deadly calm. And I'll break your arm. For a long, terrible moment, the 2 men stood locked together, the air between them crackling with violence. Martha couldn't breathe, couldn't move. She'd never seen anyone stand up to Thomas like this, never seen him stopped mid-swing. Finally, Thomas yanked his arm free, his face twisted with rage. You're both going to regret this, he spat. You think you can just steal a man's wife and get away with it? There are laws, Boone. There are people who will make sure you pay for this. Then they can take it up with me, Silas said. But you're still leaving. Now. Thomas looked at Martha, and the hatred in his eyes made her flinch. You want to be a whore, fine, but don't come crying to me when he's done with you and throws you out with nothing. Get out, Silas said. Thomas left, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Martha sat frozen, her entire body trembling. She'd done it. She'd actually defied him. And the fear that flooded through her wasn't the sharp, immediate fear of a fist. It was something deeper and more pervasive, the fear of unknown consequences, of a future she couldn't predict or control. You all right? Silas asked. She nodded, even though it was a lie. He's going to make trouble, Silas said, more to himself than to her. He'll go to town, get liquored up, start talking. By tonight, everyone in the county will have heard some version of this story.
I'm sorry, Martha whispered. Don't be sorry, you didn't do anything wrong. I left my husband. You left a man who was killing you. Silas crouched down beside her chair, his expression serious. Listen to me, Martha. What comes next is going to be hard. People are going to talk. They're going to judge. Some of them are going to say ugly things, but you've got a right to live without getting beaten, and anyone who says otherwise can go to hell. Martha looked at him, this man who barely knew her, who had no reason to care, and felt something crack open inside her chest. Why are you doing this? Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, My mother spent 20 years married to a man who used her like a punching bag. When I was 16, she finally had enough and left. My father tracked her down 3 days later and put a bullet in her head. His voice was flat, emotionless, but his eyes were dark with old pain. I was too young to stop it then. I'm not too young anymore. Martha's breath caught. I'm sorry. I'm not telling you for sympathy. I'm telling you so you know. I'm not doing this out of pity or charity or because I want something from you. I'm doing it because I should have been able to do it for her, and I couldn't, so now I'm doing it for you. The honesty of it, the raw truth, left her speechless. Go on back to the kitchen, Silas said, standing. Make breakfast for the hands. Act like nothing's changed. Can you do that? Martha nodded, even though she wasn't sure. She stood on shaking legs and walked out of the main house, across the yard, back to the kitchen that had been her prison and was now, somehow, her refuge. The hands came in for breakfast 20 minutes later, and Martha could feel the shift immediately. They knew. Of course they knew. Thomas had probably told half of them already, and the other half had figured it out from the shouting. Pete kept his eyes on his plate, his face red. Frank ate in silence, his expression neutral. Cully smirked, and when Martha refilled his coffee, he said loud enough for everyone to hear, Mighty cozy arrangement you got yourself, Ms. Holloway. Room and board and the boss's bed. That what they call it these days? The room went quiet. Martha's hand froze on the coffee pot. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor, to cease existing, but she forced herself to stay upright, to meet Cully's eyes. Mr. Boone hired me as a cook, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. Same as he hired you as a hand. Only difference is I can make a decent biscuit. A couple of the younger hands snorted, quickly covering it with coughs. Cully's smirk faded. You got a mouth on you now? He said, his tone turning ugly. That's enough, Frank said, his voice cutting through the tension. Woman's right. She cooks, we eat, and what happens between her and her husband ain't none of our business. Ex-husband, Cully muttered. Still ain't our business. The meal continued in uncomfortable silence. When the hands finally cleared out, Frank lingered, his hat in his hands. For what it's worth, he said quietly, you did the right thing. Martha looked at him, this grizzled old cowboy with kind eyes and a scarred face, and felt a rush of gratitude so strong it almost knocked her over. Thank you. Frank nodded and left. Martha spent the rest of the day in a haze of motion, cooking, cleaning, preparing meals, scrubbing pots. She kept her hands busy because if she stopped moving, she'd have to think. And if she started thinking, she'd have to face what she'd done and what it meant. Thomas didn't come back to the kitchen. She saw him once, in the distance, loading his belongings onto a wagon. He moved with sharp, angry movements, and even from across the yard, she could feel the rage radiating off him. By late afternoon, he was gone. Martha stood at the kitchen window and watched the wagon disappear down the long road that led away from the Double B Ranch, and she felt nothing. No relief, no sadness, just a vast, echoing emptiness where 6 years of her life used to be. That night, she lay in the small room off the kitchen, her room now, not theirs, and stared at the ceiling. The silence was different without Thomas's snoring, without the constant awareness of his presence like a loaded gun in the dark. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt terrifying. She'd traded one kind of prison for another, hadn't she? She was still dependent on a man's charity, still living at someone else's mercy. Only now, instead of a husband who owned her by law, she had a boss who could fire her on a whim and leave her with nothing. The thought circled her mind like a vulture, picking at her until she couldn't stand it anymore. She got up, lit the lamp,
and sat at the small table in the corner of the room. There was paper there, left over from some long ago inventory, and a pencil worn down to a nub. She wrote 3 words. I am free. Then she crossed them out. She tried again. I am safe. Crossed it out. I am. She stared at those 2 words for a long time. They felt incomplete, unfinished. But maybe that was the point. Maybe she didn't know yet what she was, what she'd become. Maybe that was something she'd have to figure out as she went. She blew out the lamp and went back to bed, and this time sleep came easier. The next week passed in a blur of routine and whispers. The hands treated her with varying degrees of respect, suspicion, and outright hostility. Cully made snide comments whenever he thought he could get away with it. Pete tried to be kind in his awkward, well-meaning way. Frank maintained his steady, quiet support, and Silas kept his distance. He came to meals, ate with the men, and treated Martha with the same polite professionalism he always had. He didn't seek her out, didn't ask how she was doing, didn't offer reassurances or explanations. At first, Martha was relieved. The last thing she needed was more scrutiny, more attention. But as the days wore on, the distance started to feel like abandonment. She'd upended her entire life on the strength of his intervention, and now he was acting like she was just another employee. Which, she reminded herself sharply, was exactly what she was. On the 8th day, everything fell apart. Martha was in town picking up supplies from the general store when she ran into Constable Jeffries. He was a stocky man with a red face and a badge that he wore like it made him better than everyone else. Mrs. Holloway, he said, his tone dripping with false politeness. I've been meaning to have a word with you. Martha's stomach dropped. Constable, your husband came to see me last week, had some concerning things to say about your current living situation. I'm working for Mr. Boone, Martha said carefully, cooking for his ranch hands. There's nothing improper about it. That's not what Thomas says. He says you abandoned your marriage vows and moved in with another man. I left an abusive husband and took a job. Jeffrey's expression hardened. You got proof of that? The abuse, I mean. Martha's hands tightened on her shopping basket. I have bruises. Bruises can come from anywhere. Falling down, being clumsy, doesn't mean a man's beating his wife. He hit me in front of Mr. Boone. Ask him. Oh, I intend to. But the thing is, Mrs. Holloway, even if your husband did lay hands on you, and I'm not saying he did, that's still a private matter between husband and wife. What you did, leaving him, taking up with another man, that's a public scandal. And I got people in this town demanding I do something about it. Do what? Martha asked, fear creeping up her spine. Well, for starters, Thomas has filed a complaint. Says Silas Boone interfered with his marriage, stole his wife, and unlawfully terminated his employment. He wants damages, and he wants you back. I'm not going back. That's not really your decision to make, ma'am. You're a married woman. Your husband has legal rights. He beat me, Martha said, her voice rising. He broke my ribs. He knocked out a tooth. He kicked me until I couldn't stand, and you're saying he has rights? Jeffries shrugged. I'm saying the law's the law. You don't like it, take it up with a judge. But until then, you need to go home to your husband. No. Excuse me? I said no. Martha's hands were shaking, but her voice came out steady and cold. I'm not going back to him. I don't care what the law says. Jeffrey's face turned an ugly shade of red. You're in violation of your marriage vows, Mrs. Holloway. That's adultery, even if nothing's happened yet. And if I get enough complaints, I can have you arrested for moral degeneracy. Then arrest me. The words came out before she could think them through, reckless and fierce. Jeffrey stared at her like she'd grown a second head. You think I won't? I think you'll do whatever Thomas pays you to do, Martha said, surprised by her own boldness. But it won't change anything. I'm not going back. She pushed past him and out of the store, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She loaded the supplies into the wagon, climbed onto the seat, and drove back to the ranch with her hands white-knuckled on the reins. Silas was in the barn when she arrived, working on a saddle repair. He looked up when she came in, took one look at her face, and set down his tools. What happened? Martha told him. Everything. The conversation with Jeffries, the threats, the implication that she could be arrested just for leaving her husband. Silas listened in silence, his expression growing darker with every word. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Thomas is pushing this, he said finally. He's not going to let it go. I know. And Jeffries is in his pocket. Thomas probably promised him money, favors, something. Jeffries doesn't care about justice. He cares about whoever pays him the most. So what do I do? Silas looked at her, his eyes steady and serious. You fight. We both do. But I need to know, are you sure? Because once this gets ugly, and it will get ugly, there's no going back. Martha thought about the last 6 years, about the bruises, the fear, the silence, about the woman she'd been, small and invisible and slowly dying. And then she thought about the woman she'd started to become. The one who'd said no to the constable, who'd walked out on her husband, who'd chosen to live instead of just survive. I'm sure, she said. All right then. Silas nodded. We'll get you a lawyer. File for divorce. Make it legal. Divorce? Martha's breath caught. She'd heard of it, of course, but it was rare, scandalous, almost unheard of outside of the biggest cities. Can we even do that here? Wyoming's got more liberal laws than most places. You can file on grounds of cruelty. We'll need witnesses, evidence, testimony. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, but it can be done. And if it doesn't work? Silas's jaw tightened. Then we'll figure something else out. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation escalated. Thomas hired a lawyer, a slick-talking man from Cheyenne named Alistair Pruitt, who filed a countersuit accusing Martha of adultery and demanding she be compelled to return to her husband. The local newspaper picked up the story, and suddenly everyone had an opinion. Some people supported her. The women, mostly. The ones who'd lived through their own private hells and recognized the bruises for what they were. They didn't say much, but they left food on the kitchen steps, nodded to her in town, offered small kindnesses that felt like lifelines. But more people condemned her. The church ladies called her a Jezebel. The men at the saloon speculated about her relationship with Silas in crude, graphic terms. Someone painted the word whore on the side of the barn in red paint, and Silas spent an entire morning scrubbing it off, his face set in grim fury. Martha tried to ignore it. She focused on her work, on keeping her head down and her mouth shut. But the weight of public opinion was crushing, and there were days when she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The worst came when Reverend Hutchins showed up at the ranch, demanding to speak with her about the state of her soul. Silas met him at the gate and told him in no uncertain terms to get the hell off his property. The Reverend left, but not before declaring loudly that both Silas and Martha would burn in eternal damnation for their sins. "Does it bother you?" Martha asked Silas that night. They were sitting on the porch of the main house, watching the sun set over the distant mountains. "What people are saying?" "No," Silas said simply. "I stopped caring what people thought of me a long time ago. I wish I could do that." "You can. You just have to decide that your peace matters more than their approval." Martha was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm scared." "I know. Not of Thomas, not anymore, but of what comes next, of being alone, of failing." "You're not alone," Silas said, "and you're not going to fail." "You don't know that." "No," he admitted. "But I believe it anyway." It was the closest thing to comfort he'd offered, and Martha held on to it like a rope in a storm. The court date was set for early June. In the meantime, Thomas continued his campaign, showing up drunk at the ranch twice and having to be escorted off by Frank and 2 other hands. He sent letters to the ranch, addressed to Martha, filled with threats and pleas and promises that if she came back, things would be different. Martha burned every one of them. And then, 3 days before the court hearing, Thomas played his final card. He showed up at the ranch with Constable Jeffries, a second deputy, and a writ signed by a judge in Cheyenne. The writ stated that Martha Holloway was to be remanded to the custody of her lawful husband pending the resolution of the divorce proceedings. Silas met them at the gate, his rifle in his hands. "She's not going anywhere," he said. "That's a court order," Jeffries said, puffing out his chest. "You interfere with that, you're breaking the law." "Then I'm breaking the law." "Silas," Martha said, stepping out of the kitchen. Her voice was calm, but her hands were shaking. "It's all right." "No, it's not." "If I don't go, they'll arrest you. And then what? You lose the ranch, I still end up with Thomas, and we've both lost everything.
Silas's jaw worked, his hands tight on the rifle. There has to be another way. There isn't. Not right now. She looked at Jeffries, at Thomas standing behind him with a smug, triumphant expression. I'll go, but this isn't over. Thomas stepped forward, reaching for her arm. Damn right it's not. You're coming home, and you're going to learn your place. Martha jerked back. Don't touch me. I'll touch you whenever I want. You're my wife. Not for long, Martha said, her voice ringing clear and strong across the yard. I'm going to divorce you, Thomas. I'm going to stand up in front of a judge and tell everyone what you did to me. And when I'm done, you'll have nothing. No wife, no reputation, nothing. Thomas's face went red, his hand rising. But before he could strike, Silas stepped between them again, the rifle barrel inches from Thomas's chest. You want her? You take her legally, Silas said, his voice deadly calm. But if you hit her, if you hurt her in any way, I will hunt you down and put a bullet in your head. That's not a threat. That's a promise. The silence that followed was thick and electric. Finally, Jeffries cleared his throat. All right, that's enough. Mrs. Holloway, you're coming with us. Mr. Boone, you're going to lower that rifle and step aside, or I'll have you arrested for threatening an officer of the law. Silas didn't move for a long moment. Then slowly he lowered the rifle. Martha walked forward, her head high, and let Jeffries lead her to the wagon. Thomas climbed in beside her, and she could smell the whiskey on his breath, the rage radiating off him in waves. As the wagon pulled away, she looked back at the ranch, at Silas standing there with his rifle and his fury and his helplessness. And she made herself a promise. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of the fight. The wagon rattled over the rutted road toward town, each jolt sending pain through Martha's ribs where old bruises hadn't quite healed. Thomas sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his anger, the weight of his presence pressing against her like a physical thing. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The threat was there in every breath, every shift of his weight, every clench of his jaw. Constable Jeffries drove, humming tunelessly, acting like he was hauling lumber instead of a woman being dragged back to her abuser. The deputy rode behind on horseback, his rifle across his saddle, insurance against any rescue attempt. Martha kept her eyes on the horizon, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight. She wouldn't give Thomas the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. She'd learned that much in 6 years. Fear fed him, made him stronger. So she starved him of it, kept her face blank, her breathing even. They were halfway to town when Thomas finally broke the silence. You made a fool of me, he said, his voice low and venomous. In front of everyone. In front of the whole damn county. Martha didn't respond. You think I'm going to forget that? Think I'm going to let you stand up in court and lie about me? I'm not going to lie, Martha said quietly. I'm going to tell the truth. Thomas's hand shot out, gripping her arm hard enough to bruise. You keep your mouth shut, you hear me? You stand up there and tell that judge you were confused, that you made a mistake, that you're sorry. You do that. And maybe, I won't make you regret every second of the last 2 weeks. Martha looked at his hand on her arm, then up at his face. Let go of me. Or what? Or nothing. Just let go. Something in her tone must have surprised him, because his grip loosened, then released. She turned back to the road, her arm throbbing, and said nothing else. They reached town just before dark. The boarding house where Thomas had been staying was a shabby 2-story building that smelled like mildew and old cooking grease. Jeffries pulled the wagon up front, climbed down, and gestured for Martha to follow. This is where you'll be staying until the hearing, he said. Mrs. Cartwright runs a respectable establishment. She'll make sure you're properly chaperoned. Chaperoned, Martha repeated, the word bitter in her mouth. To make sure I don't run away again? To make sure everything's done proper and legal, Jeffries said, his tone suggesting he didn't believe it any more than she did. Mrs. Cartwright was a thin, sour-faced woman who looked at Martha like she was something unclean. Rooms upstairs, second door on the left. Meals are at 6 and 6. You're expected to conduct yourself with decency while you're under my roof. She will, Thomas said, following Martha up the narrow staircase. I'll make sure of it. The room was small and airless, with a single bed, a washstand, and a window that overlooked the alley. Thomas closed the door behind them, and Martha's stomach clenched. Don't,
she said, backing toward the window. Don't what? Talk to my wife in private? We're not private. Mrs. Cartwright is right downstairs.
You think she cares? Thomas moved closer, and Martha could smell the whiskey sharp and sour on his breath. You think anyone in this town cares what happens to you? They all know what you are, a whore who ran off with another man. I took a job. You took a lot more than that. His hand came up, fingers grazing her cheek in a mockery of tenderness. But you're going to fix it. You're going to go into that courtroom and tell them it was all a mistake, that Silas Boone seduced you, took advantage of you, that you want to come home. Martha jerked away from his touch. I'd rather die. The slap came fast, snapping her head to the side, filling her mouth with the copper taste of blood. She stumbled, caught herself on the bedpost, and straightened up, her hand pressed to her burning cheek. Thomas grabbed her by the throat, slamming her back against the wall. You don't get to rather anything, he hissed, his face inches from hers. You're mine. The law says so. The church says so. And you're going to remember that. He squeezed, cutting off her air, and Martha clawed at his hands, her vision starting to gray at the edges. Just when she thought he wouldn't stop, when she thought this was it, he let go. She collapsed to the floor, gasping, coughing, her throat on fire. Thomas crouched down beside her, his voice soft and almost gentle. 3 days, Martha. 3 days until the hearing. You've got that long to decide whether you want to live or die. Choose smart. He left, locking the door from the outside. Martha stayed on the floor, her hand at her throat, tears streaming down her face. Not from pain, from rage, from the sheer, suffocating injustice of it all. She'd escaped. She'd fought. She'd chosen freedom. And the law had dragged her right back. The next 2 days were a special kind of hell. Martha was allowed out of her room only for meals, which she ate in silence under Mrs. Cartwright's watchful glare and the whispered commentary of the other boarders. Thomas came by every evening, never staying long, never hitting her where it would show. A shove here, a twisted arm there, a hand at her throat just long enough to remind her who was in control. On the second night, he brought Alistair Pruitt, his lawyer. Pruitt was a thin man with slicked back hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. He pulled up a chair, set his briefcase on the table, and looked at Martha like she was a problem to be solved. Mrs. Holloway, he said, his voice smooth and professional. I understand you've been under a great deal of stress lately. Martha said nothing. Your husband has informed me that you've made some rather serious allegations against him. Allegations of physical abuse. They're not allegations. They're facts. Pruitt's smile thinned. Facts require evidence, Mrs. Holloway. Do you have any? I have bruises. Bruises fade. Do you have witnesses? Medical records? Anything that can corroborate your claims? Martha thought of Silas, of Frank, of the moment on the kitchen floor when she'd thought Thomas would kill her. Silas Boone saw... Mr. Boone, Pruitt interrupted smoothly, is hardly an impartial witness. He stands to benefit from the dissolution of your marriage, does he not? After all, he's currently employing you in what many would consider a highly inappropriate arrangement. There's nothing inappropriate about it. Perhaps not, but the appearance of impropriety is often just as damaging as the reality. Pruitt leaned forward, his expression grave. Mrs. Holloway, let me be frank. If you pursue this divorce, you will lose. The judge will see a woman who abandoned her lawful husband to live with another man. He will see Mr. Boone as a man who interfered with a marriage for his own gain, and he will rule accordingly. So, what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting you drop the divorce petition, return to your husband, and put this unfortunate incident behind you. Mr. Holloway is willing to forgive your transgression. He's willing to take you back, to rebuild your marriage. All you have to do is admit you made a mistake. Martha looked at Thomas, standing by the door with his arms crossed and his expression smug. Then she looked back at Pruitt. No, she said. Pruitt blinked. Excuse me? I said no. I'm not dropping the petition. I'm not going back to him, and I'm not admitting to anything except having the courage to leave a man who was killing me. Thomas pushed off the wall, his face darkening, but Pruitt held up a hand. Mrs. Holloway, you're being unreasonable. I'm being free. You're being foolish. Without Mr. Holloway's support, you have no money, no property, no prospects. You'll be destitute. Is that really what you want? I want to not get beaten, Martha said,
her voice rising. "I want to not live in fear every single day. I want to be able to breathe without wondering if this is the time he goes too far. So yes, I'll take destitute over dead any day." Pruitt gathered his papers with a sigh. "Very well. But don't say I didn't warn you." He stood, snapped his briefcase shut, and nodded to Thomas. "I'll see you in court." After they left, Martha sat alone in the room, her hands shaking. She'd burned the bridge. There was no going back now. The hearing was tomorrow, and she had no idea what would happen, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't going to lie. The courthouse was a squat brick building in the center of town, with narrow windows and a flagpole out front. Martha walked in, flanked by Thomas on one side and Constable Jeffries on the other, like a prisoner being led to execution. The courtroom itself was small and cramped, with wooden benches that creaked under the weight of the spectators who'd come to watch the scandal unfold. Silas was already there, sitting in the front row with a lawyer Martha didn't recognize. A woman, surprisingly, with steel gray hair and sharp eyes. She stood when Martha entered, extending a hand. "Mrs. Holloway, I'm Eleanor Finch. Mr. Boone retained me to represent you in this matter." Martha shook her hand, her throat tight. "A woman lawyer?" "One of 3 in the state," Eleanor said with a faint smile, "and the only one willing to take a case this messy. Shall we?" They sat at the defendant's table, and Martha could feel the weight of every eye in the room. The whispers started immediately, a low buzz of speculation and judgment. She caught fragments of conversation, adulterous, shameless, what did she expect, and forced herself to breathe through it. Judge Harlan entered, a stern-faced man in his 60s with white hair and a reputation for being fair but unforgiving. Everyone stood, then sat again as he took his seat behind the bench. "This is a petition for divorce filed by Martha Holloway against Thomas Holloway on grounds of extreme cruelty," Harlan said, his voice carrying easily through the small room. "Mr. Pruitt, you're representing the defendant?" "I am, Your Honor." "And Miss Finch, you're representing the petitioner?" "I am." "Very well. Miss Finch, you may begin." Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirt, and addressed the court with calm confidence. "Your Honor, the facts of this case are straightforward. Mrs. Holloway endured 6 years of physical and emotional abuse at the hands of her husband. When she finally found the courage to leave, she sought employment with Mr. Silas Boone, a rancher in need of a cook. Mr. Holloway responded by attempting to force her return through intimidation, threats, and legal coercion. We are asking this court to grant Mrs. Holloway a divorce and allow her to live free from violence." "That's a compelling narrative, Ms. Finch," Harlan said dryly. "Do you have evidence to support it?" "We do, Your Honor. We have testimony from Mr. Boone, who witnessed Mr. Holloway assaulting Mrs. Holloway. We have medical evidence in the form of bruises and injuries documented by Dr. Samuel Kern, and we have Mrs. Holloway's own testimony." "Mr. Pruitt?" Pruitt rose, his expression confident. "Your Honor, what we have here is a case of marital discord, nothing more. Every marriage has its difficulties. Mrs. Holloway chose to abandon her husband rather than work through those difficulties. She then moved in with another man, creating a scandal that has damaged both Mr. Holloway's reputation and his livelihood. We contend that Mrs. Holloway's allegations are exaggerated, if not outright fabricated, and that her true motivation is to escape the responsibilities of marriage in favor of an adulterous relationship. Those are serious accusations, Mr. Pruitt, and we are prepared to prove them, Your Honor." Harlan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Very well. Ms. Finch, call your first witness." Eleanor called Silas to the stand. He walked up, calm and steady, and took the oath. Eleanor's questions were direct and methodical, leading him through the events of that day in the kitchen, the violence he'd witnessed, the intervention he'd made. "And what was Mrs. Holloway's condition when you found her?" Eleanor asked. "She was on the floor," Silas said, his voice flat. "Bleeding, bruised, could barely stand." "And Mr. Holloway?" "Standing over her, his boot was raised. He was going to kick her again." A ripple of reaction went through the courtroom. Harlan banged his gavel once, sharply. "Order." Pruitt stood for cross-examination, his expression pleasant. "Mr. Boone, you employ Mrs. Holloway, is that correct?" "Yes." "And she lives on your property?" "In a room off the kitchen." "How convenient." Pruitt's tone was mild,
but the implication was clear. Tell me, Mr. Boone, do you make a habit of interfering in your employees' marriages? I make a habit of not letting women get beaten to death on my property. But you did more than just intervene, didn't you? You fired Mr. Holloway. You offered his wife employment and housing. Some might say you orchestrated this entire situation to your benefit. Some might be idiots, Silas said evenly. Laughter broke out in the courtroom. Harlan banged his gavel again, but there was a flicker of amusement in his eyes. Mr. Boone, Pruitt pressed, isn't it true that you have romantic feelings for Mrs. Holloway? No. You expect this court to believe that your actions were purely altruistic? I don't care what you believe, Silas said. I did what was right. If that makes me guilty of something, so be it. Pruitt tried a few more angles, but Silas didn't budge. Finally, he gave up and sat down. Eleanor called Dr. Kern next, an elderly physician with kind eyes and a reputation for honesty. He described the injuries he'd documented when Martha had come to him 2 days before the hearing, bruises in various stages of healing, a partially healed fracture in her ribs, marks on her throat consistent with strangulation. In your professional opinion, Dr. Kern, were these injuries consistent with domestic violence? Eleanor asked. Absolutely, Kern said without hesitation. I've been practicing medicine for 40 years, and I know the difference between an accident and an assault. These were deliberate, repeated acts of violence. Pruitt's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. Kern was unshakable, his testimony clinical and damning. Then it was Martha's turn. She walked to the stand on shaking legs, her hand trembling as she placed it on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Eleanor approached with gentle questions at first, establishing the timeline of her marriage, the escalation of violence, the reasons she'd left. Mrs. Holloway, can you describe the worst incident of abuse you experienced? Eleanor asked. Martha swallowed hard. Last month. Thomas came home drunk. I'd burned the biscuits. She stopped, her voice breaking. Take your time. Martha took a breath, forced the words out. He beat me unconscious. When I woke up, I was on the floor, and he was asleep in his chair. I couldn't move for 2 days, could barely breathe. I thought he'd broken something inside me that wouldn't heal. The courtroom was dead silent. Why didn't you leave then? Eleanor asked gently. Because I had nowhere to go. No money, no family, and I was scared. Scared he'd find me. Scared he'd kill me. Scared I'd end up starving on the street. Martha's voice grew stronger. But then Mr. Boone saw what was happening, and for the first time in 6 years someone cared enough to help. So I took the chance. I left, and I'd do it again. Eleanor nodded. No further questions, Your Honor. Pruitt stood for cross-examination, and Martha braced herself. Mrs. Holloway, you've painted quite a picture of your husband as a violent monster, yet you stayed with him for 6 years. Why is that? I already explained, yes, fear and poverty. But the truth is, you had opportunities to leave, didn't you? You could have gone to the authorities. You could have sought help from the church. The authorities didn't care. The church told me to be a better wife. Or perhaps, Pruitt said smoothly, there was nothing to report. Perhaps your marriage was difficult, as many marriages are, but not abusive. And perhaps you only started making these allegations after you met Mr. Boone. That's not true. Isn't it? You left your husband and immediately moved in with another man. You're asking this court to believe there's no romantic involvement, but the timing is rather suspicious, don't you think? I'm asking this court to believe I have a right to live without being beaten. A convenient claim when it serves your interests. Martha's hands clenched in her lap. You want proof? Look at my ribs. Look at my throat. Look at the scars on my back from where he hit me with a belt. You want witnesses? Ask the ranch hands who heard me scream. Ask Mrs. Cartwright, who saw the bruises when I came to the boarding house. Ask anyone who's paid attention for the last 6 years. Bruises can be self-inflicted, screams can be exaggerated, and witnesses can be bought or influenced. Then you tell me, Martha said, her voice rising. What proof would be enough? What would I have to do to make you believe me? Die? The courtroom erupted. Voices shouted from the gallery, some in support, some in condemnation. Harlan's gavel cracked like gunfire. Order! I will have order in this court.
The noise died down. Pruitt sat with a satisfied smirk, and Martha realized with a sinking feeling that she'd played right into his hands. She'd lost her temper, shown emotion, made herself look unstable. Eleanor stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to call one more witness, Thomas Holloway." Pruitt objected, but Harlan allowed it. Thomas took the stand, his expression righteous and wounded. Eleanor didn't waste time. "Mr. Holloway, did you strike your wife on April 15th in the kitchen of the Double B Ranch?" "She was hysterical. I was trying to calm her down." "By hitting her?" "By restraining her. She was out of control." "Did you kick her while she was on the ground?" "I never kicked her. Silas Boone is lying." "Why would he lie?" "Because he wants my wife for himself." Eleanor let that hang for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Holloway, how much have you had to drink today?" Thomas's face flushed. "I haven't." "You reek of whiskey, Mr. Holloway. The whole courtroom can smell it. Do you have a drinking problem?" "I have a wife problem," Thomas snapped. "A wife who won't stay where she belongs." "And where does she belong?" "With me, under my authority, like the law says." Eleanor smiled, thin and sharp. "No further questions, Your Honor." Harlan called a recess. Martha sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, her head in her hands, while Eleanor paced and Silas stood guard. "You did well," Eleanor said. "Better than I expected." "I lost my temper." "You showed passion. That matters. It makes you real." "What happens now?" "Now we wait for Harlan to decide." Eleanor paused. "Martha, I need you to prepare yourself. This could go either way. Wyoming's laws are more progressive than most, but judges are still men, and men still believe wives should obey their husbands. So I might lose." "You might?" Martha looked up at Silas. "And if I do?" "Then we figure out something else," he said. "Like what?" "I don't know yet, but I'm not letting him take you back." The recess ended. They filed back into the courtroom, and Harlan took his seat, his expression grave. "I've heard the testimony and reviewed the evidence," he said. "This is not an easy decision. Marriage is a sacred institution, and divorce is not something to be granted lightly. However, I am also bound by the law to protect individuals from harm." Martha's heart pounded so hard she thought everyone could hear it. "The evidence presented by Dr. Kern is compelling. The testimony of Mr. Boone, while potentially biased, is corroborated by the medical records. And Mrs. Holloway's own testimony, while emotional, rings true." Harlan paused, his gaze settling on Thomas. "Mr. Holloway, your behavior in this courtroom has been erratic and defensive. Your admission that you believe your wife belongs under your authority, combined with the physical evidence of injury, leads me to conclude that Mrs. Holloway's allegations have merit." Thomas started to stand, but Pruitt pulled him back down. "Therefore," Harlan continued, "I'm granting the petition for divorce. The marriage between Martha Holloway and Thomas Holloway is hereby dissolved. Mrs. Holloway is free to live and work as she chooses, without interference from her former husband." The courtroom exploded. Shouts, cheers, cries of outrage. Martha sat frozen, unable to process what she'd just heard. Free. She was free. Eleanor gripped her hand. "You did it." Silas was smiling, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. And Thomas was on his feet, his face purple with rage, screaming something Martha couldn't hear over the noise. Constable Jeffries and the deputy moved to restrain him as he lunged toward the table, toward Martha. Harlan's gavel cracked again and again. "Mr. Holloway, you will control yourself or you will be held in contempt." But Thomas wasn't listening. He broke free from Jeffries, shoved past Pruitt, and came at Martha with murder in his eyes. Silas moved fast, stepping between them, and Thomas's fist connected with his jaw instead of Martha's face. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs, and then everyone was shouting, moving, pulling them apart. By the time order was restored, Thomas was in handcuffs, still screaming threats, and Silas had a split lip and a darkening bruise on his cheekbone. Harlan stood, his face thunderous. "Thomas Holloway, you are hereby held in contempt of court. You will spend the night in jail to cool off. And if you come within 100 feet of Martha Holloway after your release, I will have you arrested for harassment. Do you understand me?" Thomas spat on the floor. "Get him out of here," Harlan said wearily.
They dragged Thomas away and the courtroom slowly emptied. Martha sat in the sudden quiet, her hand shaking, her mind reeling. "It's over," Eleanor said softly. "You're free." Martha looked at her, then at Silas, then down at her own hands. Free. The word felt too big, too impossible, but it was real. The judge had said it. The law recognized it. She was free. And for the first time in 6 years, Martha Holloway let herself believe it. The walk back to the ranch felt surreal, like moving through water. Martha sat in the wagon beside Silas, the divorce decree folded in her pocket, the weight of it both lighter and heavier than she'd imagined. Eleanor had pressed it into her hands before they'd left the courthouse, her grip firm and reassuring. "Keep this safe," she'd said. "It's proof. It's official. You're a free woman now." Free. The word kept echoing in Martha's head, but she couldn't quite grasp what it meant. 6 years of marriage had taught her to think in terms of survival, not freedom. Freedom was abstract, theoretical. Survival was immediate, tangible. And now that survival was no longer the question, she didn't know what came next. Silas hadn't said much since they'd left town. His jaw was swollen where Thomas had hit him, and he kept working it gently, testing the damage. Martha wanted to apologize, to thank him, to say something that matched the enormity of what he'd done for her. But every time she opened her mouth, the words tangled up and died in her throat. "You should put some ice on that," she finally managed. Silas glanced at her, surprised. "I've had worse." "Still, it's going to bruise." "Let it bruise." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Worth it." They rode in silence after that, the wagon wheels creaking, the horses plodding along the familiar road. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed too beautiful for a day that had held so much ugliness. When they finally pulled into the ranch yard, Frank was waiting on the porch, his hat in his hands. "Well?" he asked as Silas climbed down. "She won," Silas said simply. Frank's weathered face broke into a rare smile. "I'll be damned. That's good news. Real good news. Where are the other hands?" "Gave them the evening off. Figured you two might want some quiet." Silas nodded his thanks, then turned to help Martha down from the wagon. Her legs felt unsteady, her body heavy with exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. She'd been running on fear and adrenaline for so long that now, with the immediate danger past, she felt hollow. "You hungry?" Silas asked. Martha shook her head. "Tired." "Go rest then. I'll handle dinner." "You don't have to." "Martha." His tone was gentle but firm. "Go rest." She didn't have the energy to argue. She walked to the small room off the kitchen, closed the door behind her, and sank onto the narrow bed. The divorce decree was still in her pocket, the paper crisp and official against her hip. She pulled it out, unfolded it, read the words again. "The marriage between Martha Holloway and Thomas Holloway is hereby dissolved." She traced the judge's signature with one finger, trying to make it feel real. She was Martha Holloway still, but not Mrs. Thomas Holloway. Just Martha, just herself. The distinction felt monumental. She must have fallen asleep, because the next thing she knew, it was full dark outside and someone was knocking on her door. She sat up, disoriented, her heart racing with old panic before she remembered. Thomas was in jail. She was safe. "Martha," Silas's voice low and careful. "You awake?" "Yes." She smoothed her hair, straightened her dress, opened the door. Silas stood there with a plate of food, bread, cheese, cold beef. Simple fare, but more than she could manage. "Thought you might want something, even if you're not hungry." "Thank you." She took the plate, set it on the small table. "Silas, She stopped, struggling to find words that felt adequate. "I don't know how to thank you for what you did. For all of it. You don't have to thank me. Yes, I do. You risked everything, your reputation, your business, your safety. For me. And I don't know how to—" "Martha." He stepped closer, his expression serious. "You don't owe me anything. You hear me? No debt, no obligation, nothing. You fought for your freedom, and you won it. That's all that matters. But what happens now?" The question came out small and scared. "The court said I'm free, but I still have nowhere to go, no money of my own.
I'm still, she gestured helplessly. I'm still dependent on you. For now, Silas agreed. But that can change. You've got wages coming, room and board, time to figure out what you want.
What if I don't know what I want? Then you take it one day at a time until you do. It sounded so simple when he said it. But Martha knew nothing about this was simple. The town would still talk. Thomas would still be out there, angry and humiliated. And she'd have to rebuild an entire life from nothing, with no map and no guarantee of success. I'm scared, she admitted. I know. Not of Thomas anymore. Of failing. Of not being strong enough for this. Silas was quiet for a moment.
Then he said, You left a violent husband with nothing but the clothes on your back. You stood up in court and told the truth in front of people who wanted to see you broken. You won a divorce in a system designed to keep women trapped. You think that's not strong enough? Martha's throat tightened. It doesn't feel strong. It feels like I'm barely holding on. That's what strength looks like sometimes. Not invincible, just stubborn enough to keep going. She looked at him, this man who'd saved her life and asked for nothing in return, and felt something shift in her chest. Not romantic love. She wasn't ready for that. Might never be ready for that. But something deeper, trust, maybe, or recognition. The sense that she'd found someone who saw her as a person, not a possession. I should let you sleep, Silas said, stepping back. Tomorrow's going to be another long day. Why? What happens tomorrow? People talk, word spreads, and we both have to deal with the aftermath. He was right. The court case might be over, but the social battle was just beginning. The next morning, Martha woke early and started breakfast out of habit. The kitchen felt different now, still familiar, still hers in a way, but transformed by the knowledge that she chose to be there. She wasn't hiding. She was working. The distinction mattered. The hands came in for breakfast in small groups, their reactions varying wildly. Pete congratulated her awkwardly, turning red when she thanked him. Cully stayed silent, but the hostility in his eyes made it clear his opinion hadn't changed. Frank clapped her on the shoulder and said, About damn time someone put Thomas in his place. But it was the women who surprised her. Throughout the day, they started showing up, wives and daughters and widows from neighboring ranches, women she'd only ever seen at a distance. They came with food, with words of support, with quiet acknowledgments that they understood what she'd done and why. My first husband used to beat me, said Mrs. Chen, an elderly Chinese woman who ran a laundry in town. I had no papers, no English, no money, so I stayed until he died. You did what I couldn't. Good for you. Half the women in this county are living what you lived, said Sarah Garrett, a rancher's wife with tired eyes and careful movements. You just had the courage to do something about it. Not everyone was supportive. Reverend Hutchins came by in the afternoon demanding to speak with Martha about her immortal soul. Silas met him at the gate and told him, in language that would have made a sailor blush, exactly where he could put his moral judgment. By evening, Martha was exhausted from the emotional whiplash. She sat on the kitchen steps, watching the sun set, trying to process everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. You all right? Silas asked, joining her on the steps. I don't know, Martha said honestly. Everyone has an opinion. Everyone thinks they know what I should do, how I should feel, what this all means. What do you think it means? Martha considered. I think it means I get to decide for myself now, and I have no idea how to do that. You'll learn. Will I? She turned to look at him. What if I make the wrong choices? What if I end up worse off than before? Then you make different choices. That's the point of freedom, Martha. You get to fail on your own terms. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Over the next few weeks, a new routine emerged. Martha cooked, cleaned, and managed the kitchen with increasing confidence. Silas paid her wages at the end of each week, counting out the bills and coins into her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. The first time, Martha had stared at the money for a full minute, unable to believe it was hers. What's wrong? Silas had asked. Nothing. I've never had my own money before. Well, you do now. Spend it how you like. She'd tucked it into a small tin box and hidden it under her mattress, then felt foolish for hiding something that was rightfully hers. The next week, she kept it on the table. The week after that, she opened an account at the bank in town,
walking in with her head high despite the stares and whispers. Thomas was released from jail after 3 days, and true to form, he didn't leave quietly.
He showed up at the ranch twice, drunk and belligerent, and both times Frank and 2 other hands escorted him off the property. The second time, Jeffries came along and warned Thomas that if he violated the judge's order again, he'd be arrested. "She's poison," Thomas shouted as they dragged him away. "You'll see, Boone. She'll ruin you like she ruined me." Silas had just shrugged and gone back to work. But Thomas's harassment took other forms. He spread rumors in town, ugly stories about Martha and Silas that grew more elaborate with each telling. He tried to convince other ranchers to stop doing business with the Double B. He even wrote letters to the newspaper, painting himself as a wronged husband and Martha as an adulteress. Most people ignored him, but some believed, and those believers made life difficult in small, petty ways. The general store started charging Martha higher prices. The bank clerk processed her transactions with obvious disdain. Women she'd never met crossed the street to avoid her. "Ignore them," Silas said when she mentioned it. "They'll get bored eventually." But Martha wasn't sure she could ignore it. Each slight felt like a small cut, and she was bleeding from 1,000 tiny wounds. One afternoon in late July, Martha was in town buying supplies when she saw Thomas outside the saloon. He was drunk, swaying on his feet, his clothes dirty and his face unshaven. When he saw her, his expression twisted with hatred. "There she is!" he shouted. "The whore of Wyoming!" People stopped and stared. Martha's face burned, but she kept walking, her eyes straight ahead. "Hey!" Thomas stumbled toward her. "I'm talking to you!" Martha's hands tightened on her basket. She could feel the weight of every eye, the pressure of public opinion. But she didn't stop, didn't respond. She just kept walking. Thomas grabbed her arm, spinning her around. "You think you're better than me now? You think that piece of paper makes you something special?" "Let go of me," Martha said, her voice loud and clear. "Make me." Before she could react, someone else intervened. It was Sarah Garrett, the rancher's wife, stepping between them with her market basket raised like a weapon. "You heard her," Sarah said. "Let go. This ain't your business. It is when you're making a scene in the middle of town." Sarah's voice carried authority, and other women were gathering now, forming a protective circle around Martha. "You've had your say in court, Thomas Holloway. You lost. Now leave her alone." Thomas looked around at the ring of women, his face flushing with impotent rage. Then he spat at Martha's feet and staggered away, muttering curses. Sarah turned to Martha, her expression softening. "You all right?" Martha nodded, too shaken to speak. "Come on, I'll walk you back to your wagon." The other women dispersed, and Sarah fell into step beside Martha. They walked in silence for a moment before Sarah said, "He's not going to give up, you know." "I know. Men like that, they can't stand losing, especially to a woman. He'll keep pushing until something breaks." "What do you suggest I do?" Sarah was quiet, considering. "You stay strong. You don't let him see you scared. And you remember that there are people on your side even if we can't always say it out loud." It was a small comfort, but Martha clung to it. That night, back at the ranch, Martha told Silas about the encounter. His jaw tightened, and she saw the anger flash in his eyes before he tamped it down. "He's getting desperate," Silas said. "That makes him dangerous." "What should I do?" "Don't go into town alone anymore. If you need supplies, take Frank or one of the other hands. And if Thomas comes near you again, you come find me immediately. I can't live my life running from him." "You're not running, you're being smart. There's a difference." Martha wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. Freedom didn't mean stupidity. It meant choosing her battles carefully. August brought a heat wave that turned the ranch into a furnace. The cattle grew restless, and the hands worked from dawn to dusk just to keep them watered. Martha spent her days in the kitchen, sweat dripping down her back as she cooked meal after meal, her hands red and raw from the heat. But there was a satisfaction in the work now that hadn't been there before. She was choosing this. Choosing to work, to earn, to build something of her own. One evening, as she was cleaning up after dinner, Silas came into the kitchen with a proposition. "I've been thinking," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "This arrangement, you working here, me paying you, it's temporary, we both know that." Martha's stomach dropped. "Are you firing me?" "What? No." He looked genuinely startled. "No, that's not... Martha, I'm trying to offer you a partnership." "A partnership?"
The ranch is doing well, better than expected, but I could use help with the business side, managing supplies, keeping books, dealing with buyers. You're smart, you're organized, and you know how this place runs. I'd like to make you a partner. Equal share in the profits, equal say in decisions. Martha stared at him, certain she'd misheard. You want to give me half your ranch? I want to offer you a stake in the business. Yes, not charity, partnership. You'd earn it with work, same as I do. Why would you do that? Silas pushed off from the doorframe, crossing to lean against the counter. Because I trust you. Because you've proven yourself. And because I think you deserve a chance to build something real, not just survive on someone else's charity. Martha's mind was spinning. A partnership, ownership, security that didn't depend on a man's goodwill. It was more than she'd ever imagined, more than she'd dared hope for. I don't know anything about running a ranch, she said. You'll learn. Same way you learned everything else. What if I fail? Then we fail together. Silas's expression was serious, sincere. Look, I'm not offering this lightly. I know what it means, but I also know that you're capable of more than cooking and cleaning. You've got a head for business, and you're not afraid of hard work. That's what I need in a partner. Martha looked at him, this man who'd upended her life in the best possible way, and felt tears prick at her eyes. Yes, she said, her voice rough with emotion. Yes, I'll do it. Silas smiled, broad and genuine. Good. We'll draw up the papers tomorrow. Make it official. They shook hands, and Martha felt the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. This was real. This was happening. She was going to be more than a cook, more than a survivor. She was going to be a rancher. The paperwork took weeks to finalize, but by September, it was done. Martha Holloway owned half of the Double B Ranch. Her name was on the deed, in the bank records, in all the official documents. It felt like magic. The hands took the news in stride. Frank seemed pleased. Pete was enthusiastic. Cully quit, announcing loudly that he wouldn't work for a woman. Silas let him go without argument. The real test came when they went to the cattle auction in Cheyenne. Martha stood beside Silas, dressed in her best dress, her hair pinned up, her spine straight. When the auctioneer addressed them, he spoke only to Silas. And you, sir? What are you bidding? Ask my partner, Silas said evenly. The auctioneer blinked, confused. Your partner? Silas gestured to Martha. Mrs. Holloway. She's co-owner of the Double B. Every head in the auction house turned. Martha felt the weight of their stares, the disbelief, the judgment. But she kept her chin up and her voice steady when she said, We'll take lot 17 at the listed price. The auctioneer hesitated, looking between them. Then, slowly, he nodded. Lot 17 to the Double B Ranch. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. On the way home, Silas glanced at her and said, You handled that well. I was terrified. Didn't show. Martha allowed herself a small smile. Good. They drove in comfortable silence for a while. Then Silas said, You know, when this all started, I just wanted to help you get away from Thomas. I didn't plan for any of this. Neither did I. But I'm glad it happened. Martha looked at him, at this man who'd become a friend, a partner, an anchor in the storm. So am I. Fall came, and with it, the first frost. The cattle were moved to winter pasture, the hay was stored, and the ranch settled into the quieter rhythm of the cold months. Martha spent her evenings going over the books, learning the intricacies of profit margins and supply costs and market fluctuations. It was harder than cooking, more complex, but she found she had a knack for it. In November, word reached them that Thomas had left Wyoming, heading west to California or Oregon or some other promised land where his reputation hadn't followed him. Martha felt nothing when she heard the news. No relief, no satisfaction, just a quiet acknowledgement that this chapter was finally, truly closed. Winter was hard, as Wyoming winters always were, but Martha weathered it with a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. She negotiated deals with suppliers, managed inventory, handled disputes between the hands, and slowly, grudgingly, the other ranchers started to accept her. Not as an equal, not yet, but as someone who knew what she was doing and wasn't going anywhere. On Christmas Eve, Silas brought a small pine tree into the main house and set it up in the corner. Martha helped him decorate it with popcorn strings and paper ornaments, feeling lighter than she had in years. This is nice, she said. stepping back to admire their work.
Yeah. Silas handed her a cup of coffee. It is. They sat by the fire, drinking coffee and watching the snow fall outside the window. After a while, Silas said, I've been thinking about the future, about what we're building here. What about it? I want this place to last, to mean something. And I think, he paused, choosing his words carefully, I think it already does. Because of you. Martha looked at him, surprised. Silas, I'm not saying this because I expect anything, he continued. I just want you to know that what you've done here, what you've become, it matters. You matter. Martha's throat tightened. Thank you. For what? For seeing me. For believing I could be more than what I was. You were always more, Silas said quietly. You just needed the chance to prove it. They sat in silence after that, comfortable and warm, and Martha thought about the journey that had brought her here. From a woman trapped in violence to a woman who owned her own life, her own business, her own future. It hadn't been easy, it hadn't been smooth, but it had been worth it. Every single moment had been worth it. Spring came late in 1892, arriving with mud and uncertainty and the kind of raw cold that seeped into your bones and stayed there. Martha stood at the kitchen window, watching the snow melt in uneven patches across the ranch yard, revealing brown grass and forgotten tools and all the debris that winter had hidden. She'd been at the Double B for almost a year now, and the passage of time still felt strange, both too fast and too slow, like she was living two lives at once. The woman she'd been, small and scared and silent, and the woman she was becoming, someone she didn't quite recognize yet but was starting to trust. The books were spread out on the kitchen table behind her, columns of numbers that told the story of the ranch's finances better than any words could. They'd had a good year, better than Silas had expected. The cattle had brought top dollar at auction, the hay crop had been strong, and they'd managed to expand their grazing range by leasing an additional 2,000 acres from a neighbor who'd decided ranching wasn't for him. Martha had negotiated that deal herself, sitting across from old Henry Schofield and refusing to budge on price until he'd finally thrown up his hands and agreed to her terms. You drive a hard bargain, Mrs. Holloway, he'd said, not quite able to hide his admiration. I learned from the best, she'd replied, thinking of all the ranch wives she'd watched over the years, the ones who ran the business side while their husbands played cowboy. They'd always known more than anyone gave them credit for. The sound of boots on the porch pulled her from her thoughts. Silas came in, stamping mud off his feet, his face red from the cold, his coat dusted with melting snow. Storm's coming in, he said, hanging his hat on the peg. Frank says we've got maybe 6 hours before it hits. Cattle secured? All accounted for. We'll ride it out fine. He poured himself coffee, grimacing at the taste. This is from yesterday, isn't it? This morning. You're just getting spoiled. Maybe. He sat down across from her, glancing at the ledger. How are we looking? Good. Better than good, actually. If we can negotiate a decent price on the spring calves, we'll clear enough to pay off the note on the grazing lease and still have reserve for emergency repairs. Silas nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. You know, when I made you partner, I thought I was doing you a favor. Turns out you've been doing me one. We're doing each other favors, Martha said. That's how partnership works. Is it? Silas's expression turned thoughtful. I've been thinking about that, about what this is, what we're building here. Martha felt a flutter of nervousness in her chest. This was the kind of conversation that could go in directions she wasn't ready for. Silas, not like that, he said quickly, reading her discomfort. I'm not asking for anything you're not offering. I just mean that this arrangement, this partnership, it's working. Better than I expected. And I want to make sure we're both clear on what that means going forward. What do you think it means? Silas was quiet for a moment, choosing his words. I think it means we're building something that matters. Not just a ranch, but a life. A different kind of life than either of us expected. And I think... He stopped, started again. I think that's worth protecting. Martha understood what he wasn't saying. The town still talked, people still wondered, and there were those who would love nothing more than to see their partnership fail, to prove that a man and a woman couldn't work together without impropriety. Let them talk, Martha said, echoing his words from months ago. We know the truth. Do we? Silas met her eyes. Because I'm not entirely sure I do anymore. When this started, it was simple. I was helping you escape a bad situation, but now... He gestured at the books, the kitchen, the ranch beyond the walls. Now it's more complicated. You're not just my employee or my partner, He struggled for the word. You're my friend, and I don't want to do anything that jeopardizes that. Martha felt something warm and painful expand in her chest. Friendship. Such a simple word for such a complicated feeling. But it was accurate. Silas had become the first real friend she'd ever had. The first person she trusted completely, without reservation or fear. You won't, she said quietly. Jeopardize it, I mean. As long as we're honest with each other, we'll be fine. And are we? Honest? I am. Martha paused, then added, Are you? Silas smiled, wry and a little sad. I'm trying to be. It's harder than I expected. Before Martha could ask what he meant, the door burst open and Pete stumbled in, his face white with panic. Boss, Mrs. Holloway, you need to come quick. It's Frank. He fell off the barn roof. He's not moving. They ran. Frank was lying in the mud beside the barn, his leg bent at an angle that made Martha's stomach turn. He was conscious but gray-faced with pain, his teeth clenched so hard she could hear them grinding. Fell through a rotten board, he gasped. Damn stupid. Don't talk, Silas said, kneeling beside him. He looked at Pete. Ride to town, get Dr. Kern. Fast. Pete took off at a sprint. Silas and Martha carefully moved Frank onto a board to stabilize him, then carried him into the bunkhouse. Martha fetched blankets and water while Silas examined the leg. It's broken, Silas said grimly. Clean break, looks like, but he needs a doctor to set it properly. Frank let out a string of curses that would have made a sailor proud. This is going to put us behind on everything. Don't worry about that now, Martha said, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. Just focus on not dying. Takes more than a fall to kill me, Frank muttered, but his bravado was undercut by the pain in his eyes. Dr. Kern arrived 2 hours later, by which time the storm had rolled in with a vengeance. He set Frank's leg while Martha held the old cowboy's hand and Silas helped keep him still. Frank passed out halfway through, which Dr. Kern said was a mercy. He'll be laid up for at least 2 months, the doctor said, washing his hands. Maybe 3. That leg needs time to heal properly, and at his age, bones don't knit as fast as they used to. 2 months without their most experienced hand right at the start of calving season. It was a disaster. After Dr. Kern left, Martha and Silas sat in the kitchen, exhausted and worried. We'll have to hire someone temporary, Silas said. Maybe 2 someones. We can't manage the spring work short-handed. Where are we going to find anyone this time of year? Every ranch in the territory is gearing up for calving. I don't know, but we'll figure it out. Silas rubbed his face tiredly. We always do. Martha looked at him, at the lines of stress around his eyes, the weight he carried on his shoulders, and made a decision. What if I helped? She said. Silas blinked. Helped how? With the cattle, the outdoor work. I can ride, I can rope, I know the basics. I could fill in where you need me. Martha, that's not... He struggled for words. It's hard work. Physical work. And dangerous. So is cooking for 15 men every day. So was living with Thomas. She leaned forward. I'm not saying I can replace Frank. I'm saying I can learn what I need to learn to help us get through this. We're partners, right? That means all of it, not just the parts that happen in the kitchen. Silas stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right, but you follow my lead, you don't take unnecessary risks, and if I say you're done for the day, you're done. Agreed? Agreed. The next morning, Martha traded her dress for a pair of Frank's old work pants, cinched tight with a belt, and a flannel shirt that hung loose on her frame. She braided her hair tight and tucked it under a hat, pulled on boots that were too big but would do, and presented herself for inspection. Pete wolf whistled before he could stop himself, then turned bright red. Sorry, Mrs. Holloway, you look different. I look ridiculous, Martha said. You look like a rancher, Silas corrected. Come on, let's see if you remember how to ride. She did, though it took a few minutes to find her balance. Her father had taught her when she was young, before he died and left her to navigate the world alone. She'd forgotten how much she'd loved it. The power of the horse beneath her, the wind in her face, the freedom of movement. They started with simple tasks: checking fence lines, moving cattle from one pasture to another, hauling feed. Martha's muscles screamed in protest, unused to this kind of sustained physical labor. Her hands blistered, her back ached, and she fell into bed each night so exhausted she barely remembered her head hitting the pillow. But she didn't quit. By the end of the first week, she could rope a steer without embarrassing herself. By the end of the second, she could birth a calf under Silas's supervision. It was messy, exhausting work, and there were moments when she thought her body would simply give out. But there was something deeply satisfying about it too, something primal and real. "You're a natural," Silas said one evening as they rode back to the ranch house after a long day. "I wouldn't have guessed it." "I wouldn't have either," Martha admitted, "but I like it. I like being out here, doing this. It feels—" She searched for the right word. "Honest." "It is that," Silas agreed. "No pretense, no politics, just work and whether you're smart enough to survive both." They rode in companionable silence for a while. Then Martha said, "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "Why did you never marry? You've got a good ranch, a good reputation. You could have had your pick of women." Silas was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I was engaged once, long time ago, before I came to Wyoming. Her name was Catherine. She was—" He paused. "She was everything I thought I wanted. Beautiful, accomplished, from a good family. We were going to get married in the spring. What happened? I found out she was having an affair with my business partner. Had been for months. When I confronted her, she didn't even try to deny it. Just said she'd made a choice, and it wasn't me." He shrugged, but the gesture didn't quite hide the old hurt. "So I sold everything, took what money I had, and came west. Started over." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was a long time ago, and I'm not the same person I was then. Neither is she, probably." He glanced at Martha. "What about you? Did you ever think about what your life would be like if you hadn't married Thomas?" Martha considered the question. "Sometimes, but then I think, if I hadn't married him, I wouldn't have ended up here, wouldn't have learned what I was capable of, and as much as I hate what I went through, I can't regret where it led me." She paused. "Does that make sense?" "Yeah," Silas said softly. "It does." Calving season hit like a freight train, brutal and unrelenting. For 6 weeks straight, Martha and Silas worked around the clock, catching a few hours of sleep when they could, and existing on coffee and determination. They lost 3 calves to complications and 1 cow to a difficult birth that went wrong despite their best efforts. Each loss hurt, but they kept going because that was what ranchers did. You mourned the losses and celebrated the wins and kept moving forward. By mid-May, they had 87 new calves, healthy and thriving. Frank was up and moving again, hobbling around on a cane and offering unsolicited advice. And Martha had proven, beyond any doubt, that she belonged on this ranch not just as a cook or a bookkeeper, but as a full partner. The town's opinion began to shift. Slowly, grudgingly, but shift nonetheless. When Martha rode into town wearing work pants and boots, people stared less. When she negotiated deals with suppliers, they took her seriously. When she and Silas worked side by side at the stockyards, the other ranchers acknowledged them as equals. It wasn't acceptance, not quite, but it was respect, and that mattered more. One afternoon in June, Martha was in the general store when she overheard 2 women talking. "I heard she can rope better than most men," one said. "And birth a calf single-handed," the other added. "My husband saw her do it last week, said it was impressive. Still living in sin, though." "Is it? They say it's just business. And honestly, if a woman can run a ranch, why shouldn't she?" It was a small victory, but Martha took it. The conversation was shifting from what she was doing wrong to what she was doing right, and that was progress. Summer brought its own challenges. A drought threatened the hay crop, and they had to haul water from the creek to keep the cattle hydrated. A pack of wolves took down 2 steers before Silas and Frank managed to track them down and drive them off. And Martha's body, pushed beyond its limits, finally rebelled with a fever that laid her flat for a week. Silas nursed her through it, bringing soup and water and cool cloths for her forehead. It was strange being cared for. Strange and uncomfortable and oddly intimate in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with trust. "You're going to kill yourself if you keep pushing this hard," Silas said on the fourth day, when the fever had finally broken. "I have to keep up," Martha rasped, her throat raw. "No, you don't. You're allowed to be human. You're allowed to rest." "Are you?" Silas laughed, short and surprised. "Fair point, but we're talking about you right now." "Why?" Martha struggled to sit up, frustrated by her own weakness. "Why do you care so much? Why did you help me in the first place? And don't tell me it's because of your mother. There's more to it than that." Silas sat back, his expression serious. "You're right. There is more to it." He was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "When I saw you on that kitchen floor, beaten and broken, I saw someone who deserved better. Someone who'd been ground down by circumstance and cruelty, but still had fight left in her. And I thought, if I could help you find that fight, use it. Maybe it would matter. Maybe it would mean something." He met her eyes. "You could have given up 100 times. Could have gone back to Thomas. Could have taken the easy road. Could have let the world tell you what you were worth. But you didn't. You fought. And watching you fight, watching you become this person you were always meant to be, that's been one of the greatest privileges of my life." Martha's throat tightened. "I couldn't have done it without you." "Yeah, you could have. It would have been harder, taken longer maybe. But you would have found a way because that's who you are." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken things hanging between them. Finally, Martha said, "What are we doing here, Silas? Really?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, this partnership, this life, this thing we're building. What is it? What are we to each other?" Silas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know, but I know it's important, and I know I don't want to lose it." "Neither do I." "Then maybe that's enough, for now." Martha nodded, accepting it. They didn't have to define everything. They didn't have to fit into neat categories. They could just be what they were. Two people who'd found something rare and valuable in each other and were trying to protect it. By late summer, the ranch was thriving. The cattle were healthy, the finances were solid, and they'd hired 2 new hands to replace Cully and help with the workload. One was a quiet young man named Daniel, who worked hard and kept to himself. The other was a woman. Her name was Rose Martinez, and she showed up one day asking for work with a bedroll over her shoulder and a horse that had seen better days. She was in her 30s, weathered and competent, with arms like iron and eyes that had seen trouble. "I can work cattle, mend fence, and shoot straight," she said. "I don't drink, don't fight, and I pull my weight. You pay fair, I'll stay through winter." Silas looked at Martha. Martha looked at Rose. Then she said, "You're hired." Rose became the 3rd woman to live and work on the Double B, after Martha and the cook they'd brought in to take over the kitchen duties. Her presence changed the dynamic of the ranch in subtle but important ways. The men treated her with cautious respect, and the few who didn't learned quickly that Rose could outwork and outcurse any of them. "Why'd you leave your last place?" Martha asked her one evening as they were mending fence together. "Same reason you left yours, I imagine," Rose said without looking up. "Man who thought he owned me. Only difference was he was my boss, not my husband." "What did you do?" "Put a knife through his hand when he tried to corner me in the barn. Then I rode out before he could press charges." Rose glanced at her. "Heard about your story, the divorce, the court case, all of it. That took guts. Or stupidity. Same thing sometimes." Rose hammered in a fence post with 3 efficient strikes. "But you won. That's what matters. You stood up and you won. I got lucky." "Luck's part of it. But you made your own luck by refusing to quit. Most women don't have that in them. Most women don't get the chance to find out if they do." Rose nodded slowly. "That's the truth of it, isn't it? We're all capable of more than we know. We just never get the opportunity to prove it." That conversation stuck with Martha, echoing in her mind over the following weeks. She thought about all the women she'd known, all the ones trapped in marriages they couldn't escape, in lives they couldn't change. She thought about the luck and timing and sheer stubbornness that had allowed her to break free. And she started to wonder if there was something she could do with that, some way to help others find their own way out. Fall came with its usual rush of work: hay cutting, cattle sorting, preparation for winter. Frank was back to full strength, though he moved a little slower and complained a little more. Pete had matured into a reliable hand. Daniel proved himself worth twice his wages, and Rose became as much a fixture of the ranch as anyone. One October evening, Martha and Silas were sitting on the porch of the main house, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. They'd finished the day's work early, a rare luxury, and the evening stretched out before them with unusual spaciousness. "I've been thinking," Martha said, "about the future, about what comes next." "What comes next is winter," Silas said with a smile, "and then spring, and then summer, and then—" "I'm serious. I know." His smile faded. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that we've built something good here, something that works. And I'm thinking that there are a lot of women out there who need what I needed, a chance, a choice, a way out. What if we could offer them that?" Silas turned to look at her. "You want to start taking in stray women?" "Not stray. That makes them sound like dogs. But yes, essentially. Women who need work, who need a safe place, who need time to figure out their next step. We've got the space, we've got the work, and we know it can work because it worked for me. It's a risk. Everything's a risk, but it's a risk worth taking," Silas considered, his expression thoughtful. "You'd be taking on a lot. Their problems, their pasts, their baggage." "I know. But someone took on mine. Seems like I should pay that forward." "All right," Silas said finally. "Let's do it. But we do it smart. We set boundaries, we make expectations clear, and we don't take in anyone we can't handle." "Agreed." They shook on it, and Martha felt something settle in her chest. This was right. This was what she was meant to do with the freedom she'd won. The first woman came in November. Her name was Elena, and she'd fled an abusive husband in Colorado with nothing but the clothes on her back and a black eye that was fading to yellow. Martha set her up in the small room off the kitchen, taught her to cook for the hands, and paid her a fair wage. Elena stayed through the winter and into spring, saving her money, building her confidence. When she finally left, it was to take a job at a hotel in Cheyenne, standing tall and speaking clearly and looking nothing like the broken woman who'd arrived. The second was a girl named Lily, barely 18, who'd run away from a father who'd sold her to a brothel to pay his debts. She was skittish and silent, flinching at loud noises and unexpected movements. Rose took her under her wing, teaching her to work cattle and ride and defend herself. By summer, Lily was laughing again. Word spread quietly, woman to woman, through networks that existed below the surface of polite society. The Double B became known as a place where women could go when they had nowhere else. Not a charity, but a chance. Work for wages, safety for a time, and the space to figure out what came next. Not everyone made it. Some left and went back to their old lives, unable to break the patterns that had trapped them. Some struggled with the work, with the isolation, with the sheer difficulty of starting over. But enough succeeded that it felt worthwhile. Enough found their strength that it mattered. 2 years after the divorce, Martha stood in the ranch yard and watched the sun rise over the mountains, painting the world in shades of pink and gold. The ranch had grown, expanded, prospered. They ran 400 head of cattle now, employed 20 people, and owned 8,000 acres outright. The house had been expanded to include separate quarters for the women who came through, and the bunkhouse had been rebuilt to accommodate the growing crew. Silas came out of the barn, leading his horse, and caught sight of her standing there. "You look thoughtful," he said, "just thinking about how far we've come." "We've come a long way." He swung up into the saddle. "You coming? We've got fence to check on the North Range." "In a minute." Martha turned to face him. "Silas, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you ever regret it? Taking me in, making me partner, all of it? It's changed your life completely." Silas smiled, warm and genuine. "Best decision I ever made. Hands down, no contest." Even with all the complications, the gossip, the extra work, the women coming through, especially because of those things, this place has meaning now. It's not just a ranch, it's a... He paused, searching for the word. It's a statement. It says that women matter, that they're capable, that they deserve chances. And yeah, some people hate us for it, but more people respect us.
And the ones whose opinions I actually care about, they understand. Martha felt tears prick at her eyes. Thank you for everything. Thank me by getting on your horse and helping me with that fence. We're burning daylight. She laughed and went to saddle up. That winter was hard, one of the coldest on record. They lost some cattle to the cold, had to break ice on the water troughs twice a day, and worked in temperatures that made your face hurt and your fingers go numb. But they survived it, all of them together. The hands, the women, Martha and Silas and Frank and Rose and all the rest. When spring finally came, it felt like a resurrection. Martha was in town one afternoon in April when she saw a familiar figure stumbling out of the saloon. Thomas. He'd come back, apparently, his California dreams having failed him. He was thinner than she remembered, grayer, with the look of a man who'd been beaten by life and didn't have the strength to get back up. He saw her and stopped, swaying slightly. For a moment, they just looked at each other across the muddy street. Then Thomas laughed, bitter and broken. "Look at you," he said. "Dressed like a man, acting like you own the place. You think you're something special now?" "No," Martha said calmly. "I just think I'm free." "Free!" Thomas spat the word. "You ruined my life, you know that? Destroyed my reputation, cost me everything. You did that to yourself. I just refuse to let you destroy me too." Thomas took a step toward her, and Martha's hand went to the knife she now carried on her belt. Not a kitchen knife, but a proper hunting blade that Rose had given her. She didn't draw it, but the message was clear. Thomas stopped. "You're not worth it," he muttered. "Never were." He turned and stumbled away, and Martha watched him go with something like pity. He was a broken man, hollowed out by anger and whiskey and his own inability to accept responsibility for his actions. She'd spent 6 years terrified of him, and now he was just pathetic. She rode back to the ranch feeling lighter than she had in years. That chapter was truly closed now. Thomas was nothing to her anymore. Not a threat, not a fear, just a memory that was fading with time. That summer, Silas came to her with a proposal. Not the kind she'd half feared, half hoped for over the years, but something different. "I want to make the arrangement with the women official," he said. "Set up a formal program, maybe even build a separate house for them, give them more space and privacy. But to do that, we'd need to expand the partnership. Bring in investors, maybe, or take out a loan. That's a big step. I know, but I think it's the right one. We've proven the concept works. Now we make it sustainable." Martha thought about it, weighing the risks and rewards. "All right, let's do it. But I have one condition." "What's that?" "We don't call it charity. We call it what it is. A training program. Women come here, they work, they learn skills, they earn wages. When they leave, they're qualified ranch hands or cooks or bookkeepers. We're not saving anyone, we're employing them." Silas grinned. "I can live with that." They broke ground on the new building in July. It would house up to 10 women at a time, with private rooms, a shared kitchen, and a common area for meetings and meals. The cost was steep, but they'd secured a loan from a bank in Cheyenne, whose owner had a daughter who'd escaped an abusive marriage and understood what they were trying to do. The building was completed by fall, and they held a small opening ceremony. Eleanor Finch came, along with Dr. Kern, Sarah Garrett, and a handful of other supporters. Even Frank made a short speech, which mostly consisted of him saying that women were just as stubborn as men and might as well be paid for it. Standing there in front of the new building, surrounded by people who'd helped her build this new life, Martha felt something she'd never expected to feel again. Hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope of survival, but the strong, steady hope of someone who'd built something real and lasting, something that would continue after she was gone, that would help women she'd never meet find their own way out of darkness. That night, she and Silas sat on the porch and watched the stars come out, brilliant and infinite against the black sky. "You ever think about getting married again?" Silas asked suddenly. Martha glanced at him, surprised. "Are you asking?" "No, just wondering. You've built a good life here. Seems like you might want, I don't know, a family, children, the things women are supposed to want." "Are you supposed to want things just because other people think you should?" "No. But do you want them?" Martha considered the question honestly.
I don't know. Maybe someday, but not now. Right now, this is enough, more than enough. What if the right person came along? Are we still talking hypothetically? Silas smiled. Maybe, maybe not. Martha's heart did a small, complicated flip. Silas, I care about you. A lot. You're my best friend, my partner, one of the most important people in my life. But I'm not... She struggled for words. I'm not sure I'm capable of that kind of relationship anymore. Thomas broke something in me. And I've put most of it back together, but some pieces are still missing. I don't know if I'll ever be whole enough for what you might be asking. I'm not asking for you to be whole, Silas said quietly. Nobody's whole. We're all broken pieces trying to fit together. I'm just saying, if you ever wanted to try, I'd be willing to try with you. And if I'm never ready, then we keep being what we are. Partners, friends, whatever this is. He gestured between them. It's enough for me if it's enough for you. Martha felt tears sting her eyes. It's enough. For now, it's enough. Then that's settled. Silas stood, stretched. I'm going to bed. Early start tomorrow. Silas? Yeah? Thank you for not pushing, for being patient, for everything. You're welcome. But Martha, when you are ready, if you ever are, I'll be here. No pressure, no expectations, just possibility. He went inside, leaving Martha alone with the stars and her thoughts. She sat there for a long time, thinking about the journey that had brought her here, from a woman who'd lived in fear to a woman who owned her own life. From someone who'd been told she was worthless to someone who employed dozens of people and ran a successful business. From silence to voice, from darkness to light, from captivity to freedom. It hadn't been easy. It hadn't been smooth. There had been setbacks and failures, and moments when she'd wanted to give up. But she hadn't. She'd kept going, kept fighting, kept choosing herself day after day after day. And now, sitting on this porch in the Wyoming darkness, owner of 8,000 acres and architect of her own destiny, Martha Holloway understood something fundamental. Freedom wasn't something you won once and kept forever. It was something you chose over and over, in 1,000 small decisions and 12 large ones. It was work. It was discipline. It was the daily practice of saying no to the things that diminished you and yes to the things that made you stronger. She'd chosen freedom from Thomas, freedom from fear, freedom from the limitations others tried to place on her. And in choosing those freedoms, she'd discovered something even more important. The freedom to become whoever she wanted to be. Not a wife, not a victim, not a refugee from violence, but a rancher, a businesswoman, a friend, a leader, a woman who helped other women find their own strength. Martha Holloway, who'd once been so small and silent, she'd almost disappeared entirely. Martha Holloway, who now stood tall and spoke clearly, and made decisions that affected dozens of lives. Martha Holloway, who'd survived the frontier and conquered it on her own terms. She looked up at the stars, infinite and beautiful, and smiled. This was her life, her choice, her future. And it was just beginning. 5 years later, the Double B Ranch employed 42 people, including 15 women who lived in the training house and learned skills that would set them up for independent lives. The program had been featured in newspapers as far away as San Francisco and New York, held up as an example of what was possible when you gave women opportunities instead of limitations. Martha was 34 years old, co-owner of one of the most successful ranches in Wyoming, and widely respected as a shrewd businesswoman and fair employer. She wore pants more often than dresses, could rope a steer as well as any of her hands, and had been invited to speak at the National Women's Suffrage Convention in Denver. Silas was still her partner, still her friend, still patiently waiting for something that might or might not ever happen. They'd settled into a comfortable rhythm, working side by side, challenging each other, supporting each other, building something that mattered. And if people still talked, if they still speculated and gossiped and wondered, Martha didn't care anymore. She'd learned that the opinions of small minds were just noise, and noise couldn't hurt you unless you let it in. One spring morning, Martha woke early and walked out to watch the sunrise, as she often did. The ranch was quiet, the hands still sleeping, the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. She stood in the yard she'd crossed as a terrified woman fleeing violence, And she remembered. She remembered the fear, the pain, the desperate hope that had driven her to Silas's door. But more than that, she remembered the choice. The moment when she'd decided that living in fear was worse than risking everything for freedom. The moment when she'd said no to Thomas and yes to herself. That choice had changed everything, had led to this life, this ranch, this purpose. And standing there in the dawn light, Martha understood that the choice hadn't been about leaving Thomas, or divorcing him, or even surviving him. The choice had been about claiming herself, about deciding that she mattered, that her life had value, that she deserved more than violence and submission and silence. Every woman who came through the training house was making that same choice. Every one of them was deciding that they mattered too, that they deserved better, that they were worth fighting for. And Martha got to witness it over and over, got to see them transform from broken, scared women into strong, capable ones. Got to watch them leave with their heads high and their futures bright, carrying the same truth she'd learned. You could survive anything if you refused to give up. You could build anything if you were willing to work for it. You could become anyone if you had the courage to choose. The sun crested the mountains, spilling gold across the valley, and Martha smiled. She'd survived the frontier. She'd conquered her fear. She'd chosen her own destiny. And in doing so, she'd become exactly who she was meant to be. Not perfect, not unbroken, not without scars, but free. Finally, completely, gloriously free.